My name is Ellie Mathers. I'm 41 years old. I'm a civilian trauma nurse in Corpus Christi, Texas. For 3 years, I was married to Chief Dan Mathers, Navy SEAL Bronze Star recipient, and the kind of man who made silence feel safe. And for exactly 14 minutes and 12 seconds on a Thursday morning, I was no one. Not his widow, not his legal wife, not even the woman he chose to raise his daughter. I sat in a walnut-paneled room with people who wore black, not out of grief, but out of tradition. Dan's sister Sharon sat at the head of the table. She wore a suit too expensive for mourning and a smile too calm for loss. When the lawyer opened the file, I looked down at the cup of stale coffee in my hand and tried to prepare myself for formality, for repetition, for paperwork. But I wasn't prepared for silence. Not the kind that lands on your chest like a weight and doesn't move. According to the most recent will, the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses, all financial assets, property, and residual benefits are to be inherited by Sharon Mathers, next of kin. He didn't say my name. He didn't look at me. The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The silence said enough. I felt the heat in my face first, then the tremble in my hand. I whispered, that can't be right. But it was. Because Sharon stood up with a file of her own. Your marriage lasted 3 years, she said, smiling at the judge, not at me. Dan updated his will after his second deployment. This is the certified version. I wanted to scream. Not out of anger, but disbelief. Because I had held Dan's hand when his breathing slowed. I had pressed his dog tags into his daughter's palm and told her Daddy's still watching. I had stood outside that hangar holding the flag that draped his coffin. And now I was being told I didn't count. I wasn't just erased. I was rewritten. Someone in the back coughed. Sharon folded her arms and added, "You may have loved him, Ellie, but you weren't part of his legacy. You were a temporary wife." That was the word that broke me. Temporary. Not the will. Not the signature that wasn't his. Not the judge's silence. But that word. Because nothing about what I gave Dan was temporary. Not the sleepless nights waiting for a phone call. Not the way I memorized every scar on his back. Not the lullabies I whispered into our daughter's ears when she cried for him in her sleep. I didn't fight back. Not that day. Not in front of them. Because grief teaches you something war doesn't. That there are battles best fought in silence. And that truth, when it's real, doesn't need to shout. So I left the room, without a single document, without the house I called home, without even the photograph that hung in our hallway. And I waited. Not because I was weak, but because Dan once told me, if something happens to me, you'll know what to do. Just look in the right place. He wasn't talking about lawyers. He wasn't talking about blood relatives. He was talking about something deeper. And I was about to find it. Because the people who erased me thought they had the final word. But what they didn't know was that 12 men in uniform were still waiting for the right moment to speak. And when they did, everything changed. They gave me 72 hours, 3 days to pack up my life, 3 days to convince my 8-year-old daughter that her home was no longer hers. We weren't evicted by the state or forced out by fire or flood. No, we were erased by paper. Evicted by blood that pretended we didn't belong. Sharon called it procedural. I called it betrayal, wrapped in legalese. I sat on the edge of our bed that night, still in my funeral dress, still smelling like sorrow and cheap coffee. Abby stood in the doorway, barefoot, clutching her stuffed bear with one arm and rubbing her eyes with the other. I walked over, knelt down, and wrapped her in my arms. She felt smaller than usual, like grief had shrunk her. Her voice came out again, muffled in my shoulder. "Does that mean we have to go away?" I looked around the room. Dan's uniform still hung in the corner. His boots were lined up beneath it just the way he left them before the last deployment. His cologne still full. His wedding ring still on the nightstand. The bed still smelled like him. But the house no longer felt like ours. "We're not going away," I said, smoothing her hair. "We're just making space for something new." It was a lie, but the kind you tell to keep a child whole. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through every room like I was touring a museum of memories. The kitchen where Dan taught Abby how to crack eggs without breaking the yolk. The back porch where he once surprised me with a picnic under Christmas lights. The hallway wall where we had our wedding photo framed right above the thermostat. The next morning, it was gone. I came down the stairs to find Sharon holding it already wrapped in tissue. "I figured you'd want this," she said, extending it toward me like charity. Or maybe not. I took it, not because I needed her approval, but because I needed proof. That once this love was real. That once I had a place. She followed me into the living room, arms crossed, voice brisk. "Just so you know, we'll be arranging for movers to come on Friday. Please make sure you're out by then." I wanted to scream. Not out of rage, but out of something more primal. Disbelief, disgust, dislocation. "You know Dan would never do this," I said quietly. "Not to me, not to Abby." Sharon didn't flinch. He made his wishes clear, Ellie. Sometimes love ends before the paperwork catches up. I turned away, too tired to argue, too stunned to make sense of a world where a woman like Sharon could rewrite the story and call it justice. Dan once told me that Sharon always wanted control, ever since they were kids. When their father died, she became the one who decided which memories were worth keeping. Now she decided I wasn't one of them. I started packing that afternoon. Not just clothes or toiletries, but pieces of a life I wasn't ready to let go of. Abby sat on the floor beside an open suitcase, folding her school drawings like they were fragile glass. "Will we still see Daddy's friends?" she asked. The ones with the muscles and the loud laughs. I smiled through a burning throat. Maybe. One day. Because I didn't know. Because even the people who once called me family had gone silent. When Dan was alive, we had barbecues every other Sunday. The guys from his SEAL team brought beer and war stories, and sometimes even tears. They treated Abby like their niece. They called me Mom Mathers. But after the funeral, nothing. No calls, no visits, just absence. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they were told something else. Maybe Sharon had a longer reach than I thought. That night, as Abby slept on a mattress without sheets because I'd already packed them, I stood in the living room holding our wedding photo. Dan looked so calm in that picture. Like he knew something the rest of us didn't. Like he was sure of me, of us. "I don't know what happened," I whispered into the quiet. "But I know you didn't do this. You wouldn't leave us like this. You couldn't." And as I stood there surrounded by half-filled boxes and half-erased memories, I felt it. Not rage, not revenge, but resolve. Because if Dan really left something for us, I was going to find it. No matter what they took. No matter who they silenced. They thought they had the last word. But I hadn't even started speaking. Before all of this, before courtrooms and signatures and silence, I was just a nurse. Not the hospital kind. I was a civilian trauma nurse stationed at a military base in Southern California. My job was equal parts medicine and presence. We didn't just patch up wounds, we tried to hold the human pieces together when everything else had been torn apart. That's where I met Dan. He wasn't like the others. Most SEALs carry their stories in scars or sarcasm. Dan carried his in silence. He came into my trauma bay one night after a night exercise went wrong. Nothing serious, just a dislocated shoulder and a gash along his arm. But he refused painkillers, refused help getting onto the bed, refused to speak at all except to say, "Let's get this over with." I remember telling him, half joking, "You're not in a war zone anymore. You can let someone take care of you." He didn't laugh. He just looked at me and said, "Exactly why I don't let anyone." But something changed after that night. He kept showing up not with injuries, but excuses. To drop off a report, to check on a teammate, to ask if we had extra gauze, which we always did. Eventually, he asked if I liked coffee. I said no. He brought tea instead. Dan Mathers wasn't loud or poetic or easy to figure out, but he noticed everything. He knew when I was tired before I said a word. He stood a little closer when other soldiers got too familiar. He asked about my daughter on the second date and never once called her your kid. When we got married, it was simple. A courthouse ceremony. 2 friends as witnesses. Abby dropped the ring halfway down the aisle, and Dan laughed an actual full laugh, the kind that startled even him. I hadn't heard that sound before. I lived for it afterward. We moved into base housing, a 2-bedroom unit with cracked tile and cabinets that stuck. Abby painted her room lavender with glitter stars. Dan hung fairy lights on the back porch, even though he pretended it was too domestic. Those 3 years weren't long, but they held everything. We celebrated birthdays with cupcakes and plastic forks. We danced in the kitchen when it rained. We wrote letters when he deployed, even though we could FaceTime, because Dan believed in the weight of handwriting. At night, he'd lie on the floor with Abby and let her braid his hair, even when it made him late. He wasn't trying to be perfect. He was just present. There's one night I can't forget. He came home after a week-long training. His face was dirt-streaked, his eyes hollow. He sat on the porch steps and didn't speak for hours. When I brought him tea, he finally said, "Sometimes I wonder if I'll make it back one last time, and if I don't." Will they know I was more than a uniform? I didn't say anything. I just sat beside him and held his hand. Because in that moment, I realized what made Dan different. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of being misunderstood. And maybe that's why he married me. Not because I had all the answers, but because I saw him whole, before the uniform. Before the medals, before the silence. We lived simply, but we loved deeply. And when people asked how we made it work, me with my nursing shifts, him with deployments, Abby in the middle of it all, I'd just say, we live like the war doesn't reach past the front gate. Because inside that house, there was peace. It wasn't the kind you find in books or on postcards. It was the kind you build brick by brick, scar by scar, night by night. Dan was never just a soldier to me. He was my husband. Abby's father, the man who read bedtime stories in a gravel voice and tied shoelaces with combat-torn fingers. 3 years. That's what they wrote on paper. But to me, it was a lifetime. And now they were telling me it wasn't enough. But love doesn't measure in time. It measures in presence. And Dan had been all there, every day, every hour, until he couldn't be. Most people think soldiers are tough because of their training, but the truth is what makes them unbreakable is each other. That was never more true than with Dan's SEAL team. They didn't walk into a room. They arrived, loud, fast, full of inside jokes and bruised ribs from workouts gone too far. But behind every laugh was a bond forged in places I never asked about. And every scar they carried, they let me treat. See, I wasn't just Dan's wife. Before that, I was their nurse. The first time I met Petty Officer Kane, he had a bullet graze across his shoulder and a look that said, "Don't touch me unless you want to lose a hand." 10 minutes in, I had him bandaged and smirking. 10 minutes more, he was telling Dan I was too good for a grunt like him. Dan just smiled. He knew what I hadn't realized yet, that I belonged not just to him, but to them. Every time one of them came back bruised or bloodied, I was the first face they saw after debriefing. And I wasn't soft with them. I scolded, stitched, sanitized. I told them off for eating garbage, skipping checkups, hiding pain. They called me Mom Mathers before I was ever Mrs. Mathers. It started with field injuries, then turned into backyard barbecues. Sunday nights became sacred. Dan and I would prep the grill while Abby chased their boots across the lawn. They'd bring beer stories they shouldn't tell, and enough laughter to shake the fence posts. They treated me like one of their own. They'd knock on the back door when they were too ashamed to walk into base medical. They trusted me not just with their wounds, but with their silence. I was never trained for war, but I learned how to listen without asking, how to recognize the tremor in someone's hand as a memory they couldn't shake, how to refill a coffee cup just in time to stop a panic spiral. I love those men each in a different, quiet way. And they loved Dan, not because he barked orders, but because he never once asked them to do something he wouldn't do himself. He was their brother, and I was their sister-in-law in spirit, if not by law. They used to joke she's the only woman who could outrank Dan if she wanted to. And every time someone said it, Dan would shake his head with that half smile of his and say, She doesn't need stripes. She's already the heart of this team. There's a memory I keep tucked away, one I never told anyone. Before every deployment, Dan had a ritual. He'd pack in silence like each item was a goodbye he didn't want to say out loud. And right before zipping the last pocket of his duffel, he'd pull out a small square of white cotton, a handkerchief. Soft old edges fraying. But on one corner in hand-stitched thread, my name, Ellie. I'd embroidered it for him our first year together. It was meant to be a joke. He had a cold kept sneezing in his sleeve, so I said he needed something classy. He never laughed, just pocketed it. And from that day on, he never left without it. It wasn't tactical, wasn't official. But for Dan, that square of cloth was more than fabric. It was anchor. It was promise. It was proof of me, of us, of everything he carried beyond the battlefield. I never asked what happened to it after he died. Some part of me hoped it came back, folded, tucked away in his effects, but it didn't. Or if it did, no one told me. Maybe that's why I kept sewing. Pillowcases, baby blankets, anything with thread. Because somewhere deep down, I believe something I made with my hands was still out there, still with him. They say when a soldier goes to war, they carry their country. Dan carried me. And for a few brief years, I carried them too. Sharon Mathers never liked me. She didn't need to say it out loud. Her silence was fluent enough. She was the kind of woman who entered a room and rearranged its power without touching a single chair. A corporate attorney with polished shoes, sharper words, and a mind that saw every relationship as a contract with clauses, conditions, and expiration dates. From the moment Dan introduced me, I could feel her calculation. She shook my hand too briefly, looked at my shoes instead of my eyes, and smiled with only one side of her mouth. Dan said, "She's just cautious. She's seen a lot." But I knew better. She wasn't cautious. She was territorial. And I had stepped into a life she believed should have belonged to someone else. She never forgave me for being the woman Dan chose, especially because she hadn't chosen me. To Sharon, I was small town, soft-spoken, not military, not pedigree. I was, as she once told a friend, loud enough for me to overhear temporary comfort in a long war. But what Sharon didn't know, what she refused to see, was that love isn't a resume. It's not earned in boardrooms or written into wills. It's built in kitchens and hospital rooms and late-night calls from halfway across the world. Still, when Dan died, she saw her opening. And she took it. 3 days after the funeral, she served me papers. Not gently, not discreetly, but in front of Abby while we were eating pancakes. They were wrapped in a manila envelope marked "Petition to revoke spousal inheritance rights and reassign custody." I remember opening it with sticky fingers and a mind that couldn't make sense of the words. Dan hadn't even been buried a week. And already Sharon was trying to bury me. The petition claimed Dan had filed a newer will, one that left everything to Sharon as his legal next of kin. It claimed my marriage to Dan, while legally recognized, was under contested intent at the time of his death. It claimed I was emotionally unstable and not equipped to provide long-term guardianship for Abby. I read that line 3 times. Each time the air got thinner. They weren't just taking the house, they were coming for my child. I called Sharon. She didn't answer. I emailed. She sent one sentence: "Let's keep this professional." Professional. That was the word she clung to like a shield. Sharon didn't see families. She saw assets, liabilities, risk. And to her, I was all 3. Dan once told me she used to audit his girlfriends quietly, like an IRS agent of the heart. She'd check credit scores, family history, even social media timelines. I laughed when he said it. I thought he was exaggerating. But now, reading a court petition with my name spelled wrong in half the paragraphs, I realized he wasn't. This wasn't just strategy. It was war. And she was fighting to erase me with the very tools that had once protected us. Her argument was airtight on paper. Dan had allegedly filed a will after his second deployment. It was dated, notarized, typed in neat font, and sealed with a military crest. It excluded me completely, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Dan had never mentioned revising his will. He had never spoken of Sharon as his beneficiary. He had in fact joked once that if he died, Sharon can have my golf clubs. That's all. He didn't even play golf. But suspicions aren't evidence, and love doesn't hold up in court. Legally, I was losing. Emotionally, I was unraveling. And on every page Sharon filed, one message repeated itself: I didn't belong. I wasn't family. I wasn't trusted. I wasn't fit. And just like that, with a signature and a seal, I became no one. No house, no inheritance, no custody. I was a widow without recognition, a mother without rights, a wife with no proof. But what Sharon didn't understand, what she still doesn't, is that love leaves traces. And Dan had left something behind. Not just memories, not just promises, but something real, something buried, something waiting to be found. And when it was, her strategy wouldn't matter, because even the sharpest lawyer can't rewrite the truth. The letter arrived without a name, no return address, no postmark I recognized. Just a cream-colored envelope slid under my apartment door one morning while Abby was still asleep. I almost threw it out. Lately, every envelope brought some new weight, another deadline, another denial, another reminder that my life had become paperwork and silence. But something about this one made me pause. Inside a single sheet, typed, no signature, no greeting. It read, there may be a recorded testament from Chief Mathers. It was submitted to Base Legal via direct chain. Not all documents survive transition. If you are his spouse, ask for the digital log at Joint Base Intake, timestamped 2 months before KIA report. Use his full service number. You didn't hear this from me. I read it twice then, a third time. I didn't know whether it was a cruel trick or a breadcrumb, but after everything that had been stripped from me, every word, every right, every photograph from our house that now sat in boxes I hadn't dared open, I was willing to chase ghosts. I dug through Dan's belongings, what little had been returned. Boots medals, one field notebook, his dog tags, and a slip of paper he'd tucked into the lining of his old duffel bag, his full-service ID written in his handwriting in case Abby ever needed it for school stuff one day. My fingers shook as I typed that number into the base records request form online. No hits, no digital copy, no logged video file under his name. But I remembered the letter. Ask for the digital log at Joint Base Intake, not through the system, in person. So I drove. 5 hours on the road, 1 gas station coffee, and a trunk full of doubt. Joint Base Intake sat behind thick gates and thicker bureaucracy. I wore my wedding ring on a chain that day, tucked beneath my blouse like armor. At the front desk, I asked for someone in records. The sergeant barely looked up. You'll need Form 417B and proof of familial relation. I handed over my marriage certificate. He glanced at it, then at me. Widow. I nodded. He paused, then handed me a clipboard. Write the full service number. Wait over there. 30 minutes later, an officer in a too-tight collar stepped into the room. Mrs. Mathers, he asked. Yes. He didn't shake my hand, didn't smile. Nothing's been released to civilian next of kin. And we have no file matching that timestamp. I stared at him. Are you sure? He blinked, measured. Records like that don't go missing. That was when I realized he wasn't saying no. He was saying, you're not cleared to hear yes. I leaned in quiet. Was Dan ever here? 2 months before the final op. He hesitated, then softer. He came in alone, said he wanted to update something. I assumed it was insurance. Could it have been a will? I don't know, but he did know. I saw it in the shift of his shoulders, in the way his hand twitched toward a drawer he never opened. Something had been logged, something had been filed, and now it was gone. I left empty-handed, but not empty-hearted. Someone somewhere had seen Dan record something before he died. A will, a message, a truth. And that truth had been buried beneath red tape bureaucracy, or worse. As I drove back, the highway blurred. But one thought kept repeating in my mind, louder than the engine, sharper than the wind. If the official systems failed, then I'd find the unofficial ones. Dan didn't trust institutions. He trusted people, men he bled with, men who carried him through war and back again. Men who called him brother and me, mothers. If he left something for me, someone out there still knew. Not because of duty, but because of love. This wasn't revenge. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to remember, trying to restore, trying to bring back the truth that had been rewritten. And maybe in the silence he left behind, I'd find the voice he used to protect us. Because I still believed in him, even when the world stopped believing in me. His house sat on the edge of town, past the overgrown cemetery, and a broken sign that once read, "Welcome to Jasper Creek." Now it just said, "Welcome to," with the rest rusted out. I'd driven 3 hours to get there and parked under a tree that looked like it hadn't bloomed in years. Lieutenant Colonel Rayner hadn't answered any of my calls or emails. I only found his address, because Dan once scribbled it on the back of an old receipt, told me to keep it in case you ever need someone who really knew me. I wasn't sure what I was expecting when I knocked. Maybe a barked "go away," maybe silence. But instead the door creaked open half an inch and a gravel voice asked, "Who sent you?" I stepped into view. Dan Mather's wife. Long pause. Then "He's not taking visitors." I almost laughed. "Neither am I." Another pause. Then the door opened. Just a crack more. Enough for one bloodshot eye to inspect me. He didn't invite me in, but he didn't close the door either. Rayner looked smaller than I remembered. The last time I saw him was at Dan's promotion ceremony. Back then his posture could snap a steel beam. Now his shoulders sagged like sandbags. His hair was thinner, his face gaunt. His t-shirt was clean but old, and his hands trembled slightly, like they were remembering something they didn't want to. He leaned on the door frame. "You shouldn't have come." Then I guess I wasted gas. We stared at each other. He blinked first. "I can't help you," he said. "I don't do that anymore. I'm not asking you to," I replied. "I just want to know if Dan left something, a message, a file, anything." His jaw clenched. "Don't you think I'd tell you if he had?" I reached into my bag and pulled out the one thing I knew would cut through him. Dan's handkerchief. White, frayed, and embroidered in the corner in faded navy blue thread, my name. Ellie. I held it out without a word. For a second, Rayner didn't move. Then he took a single step back, like the cloth burned, like it had a weight his hands couldn't carry anymore. His voice cracked. "You kept that?" "No, he did." I saw something flicker across his face. Not quite sorrow, not quite shame. Something harder to name. He used to bring it on every op, Rayner murmured. Wouldn't let the medics toss it. Said it was his anchor. He told me that once. Rayner turned away, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. "I don't talk about him, Ellie. Not to anyone, not even myself. Why? Because every time I do, I see his face. And I don't sleep for a week." Silence stretched between us. I thought of Abby, of how she asked if Daddy left her anything. I thought of the fake will, the judge's stamp, Sharon's voice. I looked at this man crumbling under ghosts, and I saw something rawer than anger. I saw grief with no place to go. "I think Dan left something for me," I said softly. "And I think you know where it is." Rayner stared at the horizon. "Even if I did, it's classified. He was your soldier. But he was my husband." His shoulders tightened, then sagged. "He trusted you more than he ever trusted me." You know that I didn't answer, because I did know. "I'm not ready," he whispered, "to relive that, to open that door." I stepped back. "Then don't open it for me. Open it for him." I didn't wait for a reply. I walked away back to the car, handkerchief still folded in my palm like a flag at half-mast. As I started the engine, I didn't look back. But in the rearview mirror, I saw him still standing in the doorway, not moving, but not closing the door either. And that gave me hope, because silence isn't always refusal. Sometimes it's the sound of someone gathering the strength to speak. I didn't know where to start. So I started with the only name I remembered by heart, Kane. Petty Officer Mark Kane had been Dan's teammate for nearly 8 years. He was the loud one, the one who brought ribs to our barbecues, and always let Abby sit on his shoulders to watch fireworks. Dan called him the team clown with the loyalty of a wolf. I found him in San Diego working as a civilian defense contractor. His hair was shorter now, streaked with gray at the temples. But when he opened his apartment door and saw me standing there, the laughter dropped from his face like a stone. Ellie, I nodded. I didn't expect... I'm not here to ask for anything, I said quickly. Just a question. He opened the door wider, then come in and ask it right. We sat on opposite ends of his couch, a forgotten football game buzzing in the background. He stared at the floor like it held a memory he couldn't quite place. I'm trying to find something Dan might have left behind, I said. Not things, not medals. His words, a message. Do you remember him ever saying he made a video? Something official. Kane rubbed his beard. A will. Yes. Long pause. Then, yeah, I remember. My heart skipped. You do, we were in Bahrain. Month before his last stop. He skipped dinner, said he had some paperwork to do. When he came back, he looked lighter. Not happy, just unburdened. Said he finally got something off his chest. I leaned forward. Did he say where he left it? No, just said, if anything happens, Ellie will know what to look for. We all thought he meant you'd find some journal or a thumb drive. Did he ever mention giving it to someone? Kane hesitated. Maybe Raynor. They were close in the end. Closer than I thought. I nodded. That makes sense. He looked at me. Why now, Ellie? Because I've been erased. Legally. Dan's will, the one on file, cuts me out. But I don't believe it's the last one he made. He didn't ask for proof. Didn't question my motive. He just nodded slow and steady. Do the others know? I don't think so. Well, he said standing. Maybe it's time they did. That week I drove. A lot. I crossed state lines, knocked on unfamiliar doors, and sat at unfamiliar tables. Some of the men had moved on new jobs, new wives, new names on their mailboxes. But all of them remembered Dan. Not one turned me away. Each visit started the same way. I'm not asking for help. I just need to know, do you remember Dan saying anything about leaving a final message? Sometimes they said no. Sometimes they paused and frowned, trying to fish a moment from memory. One said, he made us write ours. Said it wasn't right to fight without telling the truth first. Another said he didn't trust the system. Said if he ever left something important, it'd be with someone who saw him bleed. But it was what Chief Ramos said that stayed with me most. He used to take that handkerchief everywhere, he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. Even after we teased him. He'd fold it into the strap of his vest, called it his anchor. I smiled. I made it for him. He told us, Ramos said he didn't care if it wasn't regulation. Said when he wore it, he felt like he wasn't alone. That hit me harder than I expected, because even when he was a world away, Dan had carried us. One of the men, Jameson, took out a photo from an old storage bin. It was from the 4th of July, 2 years before Dan's last deployment. The whole team on our back porch, ribs in hand, sunburnt and smiling. And there in the corner, Dan had his arm around me, Abby on his lap, and that white handkerchief tucked into his sleeve. No medals, no ranks, just family. That's what they saw him as. And slowly, it's what they began to see me as again. Not a stranger, not a ghost, but the woman Dan chose to carry with him always. I didn't leave any of those houses with a file, but I left with something else. Affirmation, pieces, truth in fragments. And I knew if I kept going, eventually those pieces would lead me back to him. I was unpacking a grocery bag when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me said, pick it up. Ellie, it's Kane. His voice was tight, like he'd been holding it in all day. I remembered something. I set the bag down slowly. Go on. Back in Bahrain just before deployment, Dan asked me where he could safely store something off the record. I told him to go through Raynor. Raynor had clearance. More importantly, he had honor. Dan said he needed a place that wouldn't forget him even if command did. My breath caught, so he gave it to Raynor. I didn't see it happen. But 2 days later, Dan told me, if I don't come back, Raynor knows what to do. That was all I needed. I was in the car within the hour. The road back to Jasper Creek felt shorter this time. Maybe because my pulse wouldn't slow. Maybe because for the first time in weeks, I had direction. Raynor didn't answer when I knocked. But after a moment, the porch light flickered on. He opened the door just wide enough to see my face, then sighed. I figured it was time. I followed him inside. The house was dim quiet, smelled like old coffee and older memory. The walls were bare, except for a single shadow box near the fireplace, an American flag folded into a triangle, and beneath it a faded photo of young soldiers in a desert too bright to name. Raynor sat down slowly on the couch and motioned for me to do the same. He didn't speak right away, just reached under the coffee table and pulled out a small wooden box. It was plain mahogany scratched at the corners, no lock, no seal, but carved into the lid in Dan's handwriting were 8 simple words. In case I'm gone, give this to Ellie. I covered my mouth. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Raynor placed it in my lap like it weighed more than it should. He gave it to me the night before they shipped out, he said, voice low. Told me not to open it. Told me I'd know when it was time. I ran my fingers over the carving. The wood was warm from his hands, or maybe from the years it had waited. Why didn't you give it to me before I asked? Because giving it to you meant he was really gone. There was no accusation in his voice, just grief. Deep and buried like a landmine, no one dared step near. I'm sorry, he added. You shouldn't have had to go looking. I opened the box. Inside was a single USB drive, wrapped in the same handkerchief I'd stitched for Dan years ago. The thread was faded, the cotton worn, but the embroidery was still clear. Ellie. I couldn't speak. I just held it like a relic, like something holy. There was also a folded piece of paper. Dan's handwriting again. 3 lines. If you're reading this, I didn't make it. This is everything they won't say out loud. I trust you to carry what I couldn't. That was all. No date, no instructions. Raynor cleared his throat. I haven't seen what's on it. I didn't want to. That wasn't mine to witness. I nodded. Thank you for keeping it safe. He stood, walked to the fireplace, picked up the photo from the shadow box, and looked at it long and hard. He was one of the good ones, he said. And you were the best part of him. I didn't answer, because I knew if I spoke, I'd cry. Instead, I stood box in hand and headed for the door. Before I left, Raynor said one last thing. Whatever's on there, don't let anyone tell you it's not real. I turned to him. I won't. As I walked out into the fading light, I clutched the box to my chest, the handkerchief between my fingers, and for the first time since Dan's funeral, I felt like he was with me again. Not as a memory, but as a voice, waiting to be heard. I didn't open the box again until Abby was asleep. The USB sat on my kitchen table like it knew its own weight. I stared at it for a long time before sliding it into the old laptop I kept under the sink. The screen flickered. For a second, I thought it wouldn't work. Then a single file appeared. No title, no date. Just a blank icon with the video timestamp 00743. I clicked play. Dan appeared. He was wearing his dress uniform, the one I used to iron before ceremonies. His ribbons were neat, his posture straight. But his eyes, they weren't the eyes I knew. Not the eyes that softened when Abby ran into his arms. These were steadier, sharper, focused on something only he could see. He cleared his throat. If you're watching this, it means I didn't come back. The room fell silent. Even the refrigerator seemed to stop humming. I recorded this at Joint Base Command 2 months before deployment. I didn't tell anyone. Not Raynor, not my team. Just the legal officer and the camera. He took a breath. I want this on record. For the people who matter. For the people who might forget. His voice trembled slightly, not out of fear, but from holding something in too long. Everything I've built, my savings, my benefits, the house, the pension, it all belongs to Ellie and Abigail. Not my sister, not my extended family, not anyone who didn't show up. He looked down as if measuring the weight of his next words. Ellie is not my wife because she signed a paper. She's my wife because she carried me through every dark night I didn't have the words for. Because she loved me without needing to fix me. Because she never asked for anything except the truth. My throat burned. Dan looked up again. She's not part of my bloodline. She's part of my life. And that matters more. Then he smiled. Not the public smile he wore at ceremonies. This one was private, soft at the edges, like the way he used to look at me when no one else was around. If Abby ever wonders what kind of man her father was, tell her I tried. Tell her I left this because I wanted her to know that love is louder than war. That her mother is the strongest woman I've ever known. And that if I'm gone, it was never by choice. But I went knowing who I belonged to. He paused. Then one final sentence. Don't let anyone rewrite us. The screen went black. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there alone in the quiet and pressed my hands over my mouth. Because for the first time in weeks, no months, I wasn't grieving. I was vindicated. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't made it all up in the soft corners of widowhood. He saw me. He prepared for this. He protected us. The world may have tried to erase me, but Dan had left behind the truth. And the truth didn't need permission to exist. I copied the file, backed it up, twice, uploaded it to cloud storage, saved it to an encrypted drive I bought that night on a rush delivery. Because this wasn't just a message. It was evidence. And soon it would be the one thing Sharon couldn't cross out with a signature. I walked into Abby's room. She was sleeping on her side the way Dan used to. I tucked her blanket tighter and whispered, "He didn't forget us." She stirred but didn't wake. And as I stepped back into the hallway, I looked up at the ceiling and whispered something back. "I didn't forget you either." Then I turned off the light and started planning for the day the whole world would see what he left for me. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not the kind of cold that comes from air conditioning, but the kind that sinks into your skin and stays there like you're somewhere you don't belong. Sharon sat 2 rows ahead, hair perfectly pulled back her suit, just the right shade of slate gray to project calm authority. Her lawyers flanked her like sentinels folders, in hand voices, low and confident. I sat beside my attorney, palms flat against my thighs, back straight, jaw tight. We hadn't told anyone what we brought, not even the clerk, not even the judge. Because truth, when it's real, doesn't need to announce itself. Sharon's lead counsel stood first. "Your Honor," he said, "today we present what we believe is final and conclusive proof of Chief Daniel Mather's testamentary intent." He opened a folder, slid forward a printed copy of the will we'd seen before, the one that left everything to Sharon. The same one that had nearly erased me. This document was notarized, sealed, and filed in accordance with military estate protocol. Its validity is uncontested by procedural standards. The judge raised an eyebrow. "You're stating this is the final controlling document?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Without question." My lawyer stood slowly. Her voice was calm, measured. "We don't dispute that the document exists," she said. "What we question is whether it's truly final, or whether something was deliberately hidden." Sharon's counsel laughed gently. "Conspiracy theories have no place in probate." "We agree," my attorney replied. "That's why we brought something concrete." She turned toward the courtroom doors and nodded. At first, nothing happened. The silence felt like a held breath. Then the doors opened. 12 men stepped inside, uniformed, solemn, perfectly aligned. Their shoes echoed against the marble floor as they approached. One by one, they walked down the aisle past the guests, past Sharon's frozen face. I saw her fingers tighten on the edge of the table. The SEAL team didn't say a word. They didn't need to. At the front, Chief Kane, decorated, unshakable, carried a wooden box. The same box Rayner had given me. the one Dan carved with his own hands. He placed it gently on the table before the judge, then stepped back. My lawyer opened it. Inside, still wrapped in the handkerchief that had followed Dan across continents, was the USB. She held it up. Your Honor, this is a recorded final testament, digitally time-stamped, verified by military intake logs, and prepared by Chief Mathers at Joint Base Command under oath. The courtroom shifted like a wave. Sharon's lawyer objected. There's no proof this was intended as a replacement for the written will. We believe the video will speak for itself, my attorney said. The judge gestured. Then let's hear it. The bailiff brought in a monitor. The video was played. Same image, same room, same uniform, same voice. Dan's voice. If you're watching this, it means I didn't come back. Every head in the room turned toward the screen. He spoke clearly, calmly, authentically. He named me, named Abby, named the assets, the house, the pension. And then the words that shattered every argument against us. She's not part of my bloodline. She's part of my life. By the time the screen went dark, you could hear a pin drop. The judge looked directly at Sharon, then at her lawyer. He cleared his throat. Well, I believe we have a very different picture now. Sharon didn't move, didn't blink. She looked like someone who had studied every strategy, rehearsed every answer, and still lost to something she never prepared for the truth. I looked at the 12 men who stood for Dan when he could no longer stand for himself. And I felt something I hadn't felt since before the funeral. Not revenge, not triumph. Just this: I was no longer invisible. When the judge gave the nod, the bailiff dimmed the lights. The courtroom fell silent, not the usual kind of silence you hear in legal proceedings, but the kind that settles like snowfall. Even the hum of air conditioning seemed to hush itself. Every person in that room leaned slightly forward as if pulled by something invisible. Then Dan's face filled the screen. He was seated at a bare desk, wearing his full-dress uniform nameplate, visible ribbons in place. His posture was perfect, but there was a tremor just beneath his stillness. Something you wouldn't notice unless you loved him. I noticed. His eyes were steady, but his voice had that catch in it I knew so well, like he'd rehearsed this a dozen times, and still didn't know how to start. If you're watching this, I didn't make it. A collective breath held. No one dared interrupt him, not even with a cough. Dan looked directly into the camera. His voice softened. This video serves as my final testament, made voluntarily, without coercion, and with full awareness of its implications. I leave this not just to satisfy protocol, but to speak plainly in my own words. He paused. My wife is Eleanor Mathers. Ellie. I felt something break open in my chest. She's the only person who's known every version of me and still stayed. She's not just the mother of my daughter. She's the reason I came home sane every time I made it back. He reached into his pocket and pulled something out, small, white, familiar. The handkerchief. He held it up between his fingers gently. This went with me on every mission. It reminded me who I was. Not a soldier, not a weapon. A husband, a father. A man who had someone to come home to. I felt my throat close. I hadn't known he'd included that detail, but there it was, visible for everyone to see. He continued. All assets under my name, financial, residential, military, or otherwise, are to go directly to Ellie and our daughter Abigail. No exceptions. He looked down for a second, then back up. I say this because I've seen what happens when people forget the truth. When grief turns into greed, when family becomes a power struggle. His tone darkened slightly. Not angry, just firm. I love my sister. I wish her well, but she has no claim here, not over my estate, not over my child, not over the life Ellie and I built. You could hear the shift in the room. Dan leaned forward, elbows on the table. I made choices in war. I don't regret them. But this is the choice I make in peace. He looked straight into the lens. I don't leave anything to anyone but Ellie and our daughter. They are everything. He gave a faint smile, like a man who knew he'd done the hard thing and done it right. I hope this brings clarity. And if not, I hope it brings justice. The screen faded to black. No music, no closing statement. Just silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then I felt something change. It wasn't applause. It wasn't cheers. It was deeper than that, respect shifting in the air. One of the SEALs sitting just behind Sharon leaned forward. He didn't speak loudly, just loud enough for her to hear. Dan never left anyone behind, he said. Except you. Sharon didn't respond. Her face was pale, not with anger but realization, because no strategy, no filing, no clever redirection could argue with what everyone had just seen. Dan had spoken, directly, clearly, permanently. I looked at the judge, who glanced down at the transcript, then back at the USB still sitting on the table like a loaded truth. He didn't render a decision right then. That would come later. But it didn't matter, because what we needed wasn't a verdict. It was validation, and Dan had already given us that. In his voice, in his will, in his final word. The final hearing didn't begin with drama. No raised voices. No slamming of evidence. Just the soft rustle of papers, the occasional click of a pen, and the weight of truth sitting quietly on every shoulder in that courtroom. Sharon arrived with fewer lawyers this time. She looked smaller somehow, like someone who had memorized a speech and realized the audience already left. Her eyes avoided mine. For the first time since Dan's death, she had nothing to say. The judge cleared his throat and began reading the decision. After thorough review of the submitted materials, including the digital video testament, authenticated by Joint Base Command and supported by service records and military protocol, I stopped breathing. This court finds the recorded statement by Chief Daniel Mathers to be his final and controlling testament. There it was, the sentence I'd waited weeks, maybe years to hear. Dan's words were real, his intentions intact, his love preserved in a language that couldn't be forged. The judge continued. Further investigation into the timeline and presentation of the written will previously submitted by Ms. Sharon Mathers has led to procedural concerns. In light of these findings, the matter has been referred for criminal review. There were no gasps, just the creaking of one courtroom bench as Sharon shifted her face, blank, her shoulders rigid. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. Then came the last piece. This court restores full custodial guardianship of minor Abigail Mathers to her biological mother and sole legal guardian, Mrs. Eleanor Mathers. I closed my eyes. For a long time, I had lived in a limbo that didn't have a name. Not widow, not wife, not mother, not claimant. I was all of them, and none of them depending on who held the paper. But that day I stepped fully into my name again. After the hearing, as the courtroom cleared, people came to shake my hand. Some I didn't recognize, veterans clerks, quiet strangers who had just seen me. Kane was the last to approach. He didn't say anything, just hugged me with both arms like he had the night Dan was buried. Then he whispered, "He'd be proud, Ma Mathers." I smiled through the knot in my throat. "Not because I won," I said, "because I didn't quit." And that was the truth of it. I didn't win. I reclaimed. I didn't conquer. I restored. And I didn't prove myself to Sharon or to the court or even to the SEALs. I proved something to the woman who stared back at me in the mirror every morning, the one who kept showing up even when everything else told her to disappear. Because in the end, I didn't want more than I was owed. I just wanted what Dan already gave me. His trust, his name, his voice, his truth. And that finally was mine again. The settlement was more than I expected. Dan's pension, survivor benefits, insurance, the house, the car, the savings, all under my name again, as it always should have been. For a moment, the temptation was there to hold it all, to keep everything that had nearly been stolen, to plant a flag and say, "This is mine." Every cent, but something in me resisted. Because Dan didn't live that way. He never fought to accumulate, he fought to protect. And now it was my turn to protect something bigger. I met with a financial advisor, asked about setting up a scholarship fund. Not just in Dan's name, but in the name of every fallen service member who never got to come home to their child's graduation, their wife's embrace, or the sound of laughter from a backyard birthday party. We called it the Quiet Anchor Fund, for the children of the quiet ones. I used most of the settlement to establish it, enough to keep it running for years, enough to make a difference without waiting for applause. Abby helped me design the logo. It was a folded flag wrapped in a handkerchief. She chose the colors. She said, "This way, it always feels like Daddy's still giving." And that was enough for me. A few weeks later, Sharon called. I almost didn't answer, but something told me let her speak. Her voice was different, slower, unsteady. "I'm not calling to argue," she said. "I'm calling because I think I got it wrong. I didn't say anything. I thought I was protecting Dan's legacy," she continued. "But I think what I really wanted was control. Because if I could control the narrative, maybe I wouldn't have to sit with the grief." There it was, not an apology, not at first, but a reckoning. Then finally, "I'm sorry, Ellie. Not because I lost, because Dan was right. About you, about everything." I waited a long breath before answering. "I forgive you," I said. "But I don't forget." There was silence on the line. Then she said, "That's fair. We didn't make plans. We didn't pretend to be something we weren't." But the call ended without bitterness. And for once, I didn't feel the weight of her name pressing against mine. The past didn't vanish, but it softened. And in that softening, there was space for truth, for grace, for legacy. Not long after I visited Dan's grave with Abby, we didn't bring flowers. We brought a printout of the first scholarship recipient's letter, a thank you from a teenager whose dad never made it home from Kandahar. I read it aloud while Abby traced the letters on his headstone. Then I placed the handkerchief beside it, folded perfectly. She looked up at me. "Do you think Daddy can hear us?" I nodded. I think he always did. And I think in that moment he was still listening. I went back to work the following spring. Same base, same clinic, same hallway where I first met Dan. The walls hadn't changed much, still the same fading posters about resilience, the same hum of fluorescent lights, but I had. Not in the way people talk about healing. More like something in me had settled. Not moved on, but grown roots in a deeper place. I was still a trauma nurse. Still patching wounds, still holding hands during hard news. But now the families I cared for looked at me differently. Not because they knew my story. Most didn't. But because I carried something quieter. A steadiness. Maybe a grief that had learned how to stand up straight. I kept Dan's photo on my desk. Not the military portrait, but the one Abby took on her birthday. The one where he's laughing mid-sentence, holding a cupcake in one hand and her tiny fingers in the other. His uniform was wrinkled. His smile wasn't. Next to the photo, folded neatly, was the handkerchief. It had faded over time and the embroidery was barely legible. But I didn't need to read it. I knew every thread by heart. Sometimes, between appointments, I'd run my thumb along the corner and remember how he used to fold it into his gear, how it went with him on every mission like a tether to a life he chose beyond the battlefield. Abby was growing fast, taller, quieter. She had Dan's eyes, now the serious kind, the kind that watched before speaking. At night, she'd sometimes ask for stories. Not about the war, about him. "Tell me the one where he burned the pancakes," she'd say. Or, "Tell me about when he carried me on his shoulders through the rain." I told them all, every detail, even the ones that hurt, because I never wanted her to wonder who her father had been. I wanted her to know. One Saturday afternoon, as we were folding laundry, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Abby peered out the window. "It's a man in uniform," she said. Kind of familiar. It was Ramos, one of Dan's old teammates. He looked older like we all did, but his eyes were gentle. "I was cleaning out some things," he said, "and I found this." He handed me a small envelope yellowed at the edges. My name wasn't on it, but Abby's was, in Dan's handwriting. She took it carefully, like it might crumble in her hands. We sat on the couch as she unfolded the page. The letter was short, Simple. But I watched her eyes widen as she read. Abby, if this reaches you, it means I didn't come home. That's hard to write, but I want you to know something important. You are the reason I kept going, the reason I fought, the reason I wasn't afraid to die because I had something worth living for. Be kind. Be brave. Listen to your mom. She's stronger than you know. And remember, no matter what, Daddy never left you. I'm always with you. Love, Dad. Abby didn't cry. She folded the letter slowly, held it against her chest, and turned to me. I understand now, she whispered. He never left us. I pulled her close, my cheek against her hair. No, sweetheart, I said. He never did. Outside, the sun was setting. Light spilled across the floor, touching Dan's photo on my desk. For a moment, it felt like he was in the room, not as a ghost, but as something woven into our lives, into our breath, our choices, our laughter. Some people say legacy is about medals, accolades, headlines, but I think it's quieter than that. I think it's a letter tucked in a drawer, a handkerchief folded beside a photo, a child who knows without a doubt that she was loved. I was never the woman they expected Dan to marry, but I was the woman who stayed, who remembered, who carried him forward. And sometimes when the day is quiet and Abby's laughter echoes down the hall, I whisper it out loud just so the world remembers too. I'm Ellie Mathers, his wife, still. The snow came early that year, not the heavy kind that shuts everything down. The soft kind, the kind that settles gently on rooftops and fence posts and front lawns like a memory returning home. I was out in the yard with a broom brushing off the walkway, wrapped in Dan's old service jacket. It hung too big on me, sleeves past my wrists, but it was warm in all the right places. I bent down to pick up the flag. It had once been folded and placed in my arms at the gravesite. Back then, I barely felt its weight through the numbness. Now I unfolded it, slowly laid it out across the porch railing, and ran my hand across every star. This flag had covered Dan's casket. It had been touched by soldiers, folded with care, handed off with solemn words. And now it lived here, not in a glass case, not on a wall, but in the open air beneath a sky that still turned each morning. As I folded it again, corner over corner, triangle after triangle, I found myself whispering. I was erased from the paperwork, but not from your truth, because the truth had always been louder than the noise. I was his wife, not because a court said so, because he said so, in uniform, on camera, with a voice that trembled but never lied. They tried to write me out, to undo everything we'd built. But Dan's love was not provisional, and his will both in spirit and in law endured. Inside the house was quiet. Abby was reading at the kitchen table, her legs swinging gently beneath the chair. The light caught her hair just like it used to catch his golden at the edges, soft despite the storm. I stepped into the study and pulled open the drawer. The handkerchief, the USB, a photocopy of the real will. I placed them all inside. Not to hide them, but to keep them close, not as evidence, but as legacy. Some things don't need to be displayed to be honored. I closed the drawer and sat for a moment listening, to silence, to snow, to the sound of a home that had finally made space for peace. I used to think honor had to be defended loudly, urgently, but I was wrong. Honor doesn't need proof, it just needs to be lived. I pressed my hand against the drawer, whispered one last time. Thank you, Dan, for remembering, for preparing, for never letting go, and then I smiled, a small one but real, because the flag never folds in on itself. It folds to be carried. And now it's my turn to carry what he left with grace. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today, wherever you are. I hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.